Welcome, everybody, to section 3B. If you are not looking for 3B, now will be your time to exit. We are so excited to hear our papers today and really grateful to all of our presenters and our featured respondent, Father Erick Berrelleza. So before we begin, I want to quickly go over the format for the session today. So we'll have the two presentations and then Father Berrelleza's response. And with any remaining time, we'll open to questions and open dialogue. We are a pretty small group, so feel free to just kind of unmute yourself so we can have a more free-flowing discussion, but you are also welcome to use the raise hand function or send a message to me in the chat, which I will be paying attention to, so really up to you. I want to introduce Father Berrelleza. Father Berrelleza joined the Santa Clara Department of Sociology in 2021. His research on place and space considers the contestations that occur at the micro level through interactions, practices, and structures. He uses ethnography as well as visual and spatial methods in his research. He's studied the broad exclusionary effects of gentrification within an urban church in Boston, Massachusetts, and the everyday production sanctuary movement. The everyday production and practices of sanctuary by undocumented immigrants living in spaces of confinement in the new sanctuary movement. His most recent project is a comparative ethnography of Latino religious life in urban and rural North Carolina. Berrelleza, originally from Los Angeles, is a Jesuit priest of the USA West Province. He completed undergraduate studies at Loyola Marymount University and a graduate degree in theology from Boston College. He's a Red Sox fan and enjoys running and exploring the cultures of cities. So welcome, Father Berrelleza, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to start with a paper co-presented by Anna Holleman and Pamela Zabala from Duke University. Anna Holleman is a postdoctoral associate at the Duke University Center for Health Policy and Inequalities Research. She holds a PhD in sociology from Duke University, where her dissertation focused on the ways religious institutions are shaped by and respond to societal inequalities in the United States. And Pamela Zabala is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Duke University. Her dissertation focuses on the secondary migration of Caribbean immigrants from the Northeast to the Southern United States. And they will be presenting today on theological foundations of civil disobedience and racial awareness in the sanctuary movement. So take it away.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen, and then I think Pamela's going to start us off. So I will go ahead.
Presentation.
Great. Okay. All right, does that look normal to everybody, hopefully? Cool, okay.
Yes.
I'll let Pamela go.
Great. I just wanted to check that you can hear me. You good?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody, good afternoon. In this project that Anna and I are going to present today, we are using the sanctuary movement as a case study for examining the theological foundations that congregational leaders draw on to justify and understand their political actions, especially around racial awareness and civil disobedience. So we know from past literature on religion and politics that clergy and congregations have a long history of participating in various kinds of political organizing and cue giving and protesting. And we're not going to speak too much about the background because Joseph is also going to present on this and the ways that this manifests itself within religious congregations. And we don't want to be too repetitive, but we're just going to jump right into the current project. So, as I said, we're interested in researching the theological foundations for the particular tenor of protests in the current political era. And so our research question was, how did white religious leaders theologically frame their actions of civil disobedience and their development of racial awareness in the Trump era? So, study, specifically the most recent wave of it, and to give a little information, as an undocumented immigrant in the congregational space in order to prevent congregation the Reagan administration policies of sponsoring wars in Nicaragua and Ecuador, when congregations recognized that refugees often had nowhere to go, but churches, church sanctuaries, and the floors of their fellowship halls were often available. And so the goal was to put pressure on the administration to change their policies. And after the Reagan administration, the sanctuary movement sort of waned, but it rose to prominence again during the Bush administration's efforts to pass immigration reform legislation in the mid 2000s. And then the third wave of the sanctuary movement, which is the one we situate this project in, came about during the Trump administration as a result of sort of his negative rhetoric and harmful policies towards immigrants. Excellent. 60 individuals were in public sanctuary during the Trump presidency, and 30 were still in sanctuary at the end of the administration. And since then, the Biden administration has worked with a lot of these individuals to get them out of sanctuary and out of these congregational spaces, but we wanted to focus on the ones that were in sanctuary during the Trump presidency. And so we did a qualitative study in which we conducted 42 interviews between April and October 2020 with leaders from 41 religious congregations who physically housed an undocumented individual in their congregational space during the Trump presidency. And so in our example, we spoke to 32 ordained clergy persons and 13 lay leaders. And it consisted of 39 mainline congregations and 2 Jewish congregations. And we had congregations represented from all over the country as well. Next slide. So we found that our respondents were really quick to demonstrate that they were sort of fluent in their topics concerning race and systemic racism and white privilege and/or white supremacy. So almost all of our respondents, about 92% of them, discussed these topics in some form, which was especially notable to us because we never actually set out to ask them their thoughts about race and racism. They just sort of volunteered this information. And even though we were just kind of seeking to learn about the sanctuary movement broadly. So we learned very quickly that their understandings on the sanctuary movement and on their understanding of anti-racism was fundamental to their sanctuary work. And one respondent, for example, spoke of the importance of being, quote, alert and active to the current of white supremacy and to the ways in which white supremacy is at work in our communities in all sorts of ways. Next slide. So even though they sort of presented this racial awareness, a lot of it was a recent development for a lot of them, fairly recent. So 31 of the respondents, about 75% of the sample, pointed to the election of Donald Trump as sort of a critical turning point in their awareness and activism concerning the immigration system specifically and racism more broadly. So for example, one respondent reported that after the 2016 election, activism became not just a cool thought, but an urgent priority with the new regime. And another stated that meaning racism, is not a new thing, but all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, there's racism and we've got to do something now, end quote. So I'll hand this over to Anna now, and she'll discuss the rest of the findings.
Great, thank you. So shifting over to me. Again, we established that the leaders of these congregations were incredibly racially aware, willing to talk about it, despite the fact, again, like Pamela said, we never really explicitly asked about it. We were asking questions more about sanctuary broadly. So despite the fact that our respondents had recently developed this racial awareness, we also found that they were willing to take action and leverage their resources and their political connections to fight racism through their sanctuary advocacy. So our respondents and their congregations often had large budgets, centrally located and historical buildings, powerful political connections throughout their cities and towns in which they were located. And we found that they leveraged these connections during their sanctuary work. As one respondent said, we also had support from our senators, particularly a particular senator was wonderful. I mean, he showed up at multiple events, and the state attorney general showed up, and we had one of our city councilmen who was actively involved. And so we had that kind of support from the law. And so clearly this sort of support from the law would not have been present for an undocumented individual just at a singular level. But because these congregations were willing to leverage their own status on behalf of the individual they were housing, it was possible. Participants also discussed their willingness to put themselves and other congregants at risk in order to be able to provide sanctuary. 3/4 of our respondents said that they and their congregations had to work through questions and fears concerning the legality of housing an undocumented individual. Some reported that this was specifically pertaining to questions of parishioner liability at the personal level, especially parishioners who were lawyers or government officials who felt like they might need to leave the congregation if an undocumented individual was housed there. But there were also concerns at the level of the congregation itself. So, for example, one respondent, when talking about the insurance of the organization itself, said, I checked with our insurance company and I read our insurance policy, and they have a statement in there that reads, insurance does not apply to personal and bodily injury or property damage arising out of the willful violation of a penal statute or ordinance committed by or with the knowledge of or consent of any insured. So this would mean that for our church, our insurance might not be valid if something happened. So we go through all of this to just say the risks were not marginal to these congregations. For example, I basically just read out exact language from an insurance policy that this person just spoke to me by memory. And so this was something that they had spent a lot of time thinking through. However, despite these fears and this calculated risk, all of our respondents and their congregations decided to provide sanctuary. So we go through all this to just establish that our respondents and the congregations they led were racially cognizant and politically active in their approach to racial inequality, and they were willing to risk both their organizational well-being as well as sometimes their own personal well-being and leverage their own privilege on behalf of non-white individuals. So now we want to get into the theological framing for this activism. So though our respondents drew on a variety of theological and biblical passages to frame and justify their actions concerning racial inequality, two central biblical passages emerged prominently that many of our respondents drew on. So the first was the idea of welcoming the stranger, drawn from Matthew 25, which states, for I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And it goes on, obviously, but that idea of welcoming the stranger was really core to these congregations. The second theological framing was the idea of loving your neighbor, drawn from Mark 12, which goes through the greatest commandment, and which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. And then says the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And so these were really the two central scripture passages that came up over and over. However, it's interesting, our respondents consistently sort of recast these traditional, very familiar theological biblical frames in terms of their racial awareness. So for example, one of our respondents framed this maxim to love your neighbor in terms of the current racial climate, asking, how do we love our neighbor if we don't care about the fact that they're being racialized in a way that is oppressive and that I'm being racialized in a way that is privileged? So we saw these were really animating the work of our respondents. And another note is that initially we found this very interesting because loving our neighbor, sort of casting an undocumented individual as a neighbor, seems sort of opposite from casting an undocumented individual as a stranger, right? These are two sort of seemingly opposing ideas, but most of our respondents use both theological ideas sort of interchangeably. So it wasn't that one was predicting a certain kind of activism and one was predicting another, but it was sort of that these two sort of parallel ideas, I guess, had sort of gone into the water, so to speak, of sanctuary. So second, in addition to those two specific sort of theological passages, our respondents also tapped into the tradition of liberation theology in framing their sanctuary advocacy to understand the power of God on behalf of those they were advocating for. So as one of our respondents told us, God has a preferential option towards the poor, the oppressed, the undocumented. And if you seek to be close to God, if you seek to be acting in the way that God calls us to act in the world, you will inevitably find yourself taking risks for justice. And so we found this especially interesting as these respondents, who are, again, are predominantly white, predominantly well-off financially, predominantly societally powerful individuals and congregations and organizations, were drawing on an understanding of a God who was not on the side of themselves, the well-resourced and the powerful, but rather on behalf of the individuals with much less societal power than themselves. So one final thing we wanted to talk about was the relative unimportance of preaching to our respondents. So this was pretty interesting to us because we expected to, we asked all of our respondents, did you preach on sanctuary? What did you preach on? Because we know from the past literature on political mobilization of congregations, which I know Joseph will talk about a little bit, that cue giving is really important, especially through preaching. However, we found that none of our respondents found preaching to be a really important part of their political mobilization. So either our respondents consistently reported that they had not preached on sanctuary or on race at all, or if they had preached on it, they didn't remember what they preached on, implying that it wasn't super important to them. So for example, we asked a respondent if he had preached on the subject of sanctuary, and he answered simply, I don't think so. And when, we were sort of surprised by that answer. And so when we asked if he remembered what he might have preached on, he just answered, boy, I don't, sorry. And that was the end. There was no other sort of place to go with it. Another person, when we asked if he had preached on sanctuary, just said there was no sermon series. So again, this was a place that surprised us. So rather than the importance of preaching, which again, we sort of expected, congregational leaders communicated to us that they understand that their advocacy for welcoming the stranger and loving their neighbor rather was simply in the culture of their congregation. For example, as one respondent put it, we had open congregational meetings where we would report on where we were and have questions raised and conversations. All of that was brought up. But as far as specific theological foundations and those sorts of things, I mean, that's part and parcel to who we are. So we did not have any specific studies per se. So rather than focusing on sort of preaching and cue giving in sort of an explicit way from the pulpit, just this sort of racial awareness and willingness to sacrifice on behalf of their neighbor or welcoming the stranger was just sort of part and parcel to who they were. So finally, in conclusion, just to wrap things up, in summary, we examined the theological foundations that congregational leaders drew on to justify their political actions, specifically political actions regarding race and racial awareness in our current political era. We found that our sample predominantly drew on these two specific biblical tropes, as well as on a larger framework of liberation theology to understand that the power of God was on behalf of those they were advocating for. We also found that congregational leaders downplayed the importance of preaching in comparison to the overall congregational culture. We also want to note importantly that obviously our respondents were not perfect. We're not claiming that they were a post-racial sample. At times they did draw on racialized language or tropes or spoke about race in ways that focused on the individual level at the expense of sort of a robust understanding of the larger structural forces at play. Obviously, these are white individuals learning about and responding to the social construction of race and racism in a political climate fraught with racial animus. So though these pastors are fighting structural racism in many ways, they may also be perpetuating it in some ways. And so we did want to include that caveat. And then finally, I think our findings have important implications for research going forward on the interaction between theology and activism, as well as on the ways that congregations mobilize, the importance of theology and congregational culture specifically, and the ways that those things interact and change with the current political climate. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna and Pamela. We're gonna go right ahead to our second presenter, and then we'll have all of the responses together after that. So next up, we have Joseph Rozo from Duke University. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Duke, specializing in the sociology of religion and research methodology. His work primarily focuses on religious organizations and trends in religious practices, beliefs, and political discourse. The paper he will be presenting is titled The Theological Underpinnings of the political activism of religious clergy. Go ahead, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try to share my screen. What's that? Okay, can you see this?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So thank you so much. I'll be presenting about the theological underpinnings of religious clergy's political activism. And as it starts moving, there we go. So as we know, religious leaders and clergy are important political actors and community leaders. They are community organizers, and they also act as moral authorities for their parishioners. And as Anna alluded to, they can engage in political action, bringing together members of their community, as well as speak with authority on religious subjects and guide the way people think about politics. And so as such, there's been a lot of interest in understanding the political activism of clergy as they're important political actors. And broadly speaking, the activism that clergy engage in can be divided into two types. And again, Anna alluded to this, Anna and Pamela alluded to this earlier. So there's the cue-giving type, which involves preaching on controversial political issues and guiding parishioners in how they should think about issues in the public sphere. And there's direct action, which involves actually going out on the streets, protesting, lobbying elected officials, and organizing groups within the congregation and in the community to take political action. Now, these are often complementary activities, and many clergy do both, but it is worth, as you'll soon see, it's worth it to analytically separate these two types of activities. Now, one of the major predictors of political activism among clergy that's been studied is the theological beliefs of clergy. And a lot of this is rooted in studies done in the 60s and 70s, spurred by the civil rights movement. And so there was a lot of research on clergy and their activism in the civil rights movement, as well as anti-war movements in this time. And overall, these studies found and argued that a distinct liberal theology was associated with political activism. And I say liberal theology, not just liberal politics, because this was a theology that emphasized an inner worldly approach, that as followers of God, clergy were tasked with making the world a more just and fair place. And their role as clergy was not just to save souls or to make moral pronouncements, but to actually affect change in the world. And so these scholars found that, or argued that it was this sort of theological orientation that underpinned the political activism of clergy, whereas more conservative theologies, which were focused on salvation and other worldly concerns, did not inspire political activism. However, that this approach changed in the literature in the 80s and 90s with the rise of the religious right to political prominence and moral majority and prominent evangelists who were promoting particular political candidates and ideas. And so this led some to argue that conservative theology could also underpin political activism, that perhaps it was on different issues, but that clergy who were committed and had orthodox or conservative viewpoints were still inspired to engage in political discourse. But in recent times, there's been a dearth of large data, nationally representative data, to see if these trends have continued. Today, we don't know what the relationship is necessarily between theological beliefs and political activism. There's not a nationally representative data set out there. Has it changed? And another question is, are these beliefs just a proxy for political beliefs? We know partisanship undergirds a lot of cultural and religious orientations. So are these findings of liberal or conservative theological beliefs really just capturing a political partisanship? And also, these previous studies discussed cue giving and direct action as complementary and looked at how theological orientations affected both, but is there a different relationship? These are two related but distinct types of political activities. And then finally, a lot of the research in the past has focused on mostly on white Protestants. There has been some research on Catholics and Black Protestants, but a lot of the research focused on the theological underpinnings of political activism has been focused on comparing white mainline Protestants with white evangelical Protestants. So do the relationships we find here hold true for Black Protestants, Catholics, and non-Christians? So to answer that question, I'd use a recent nationally representative sample of Clergy, the National Survey of Religious Leaders. The survey was conducted from 2019 through 2020 and has a sample of 890 primary congregational leaders. So these are people within congregations who said, I am the main leader. Typically it's a pastor, or typically they have the title of pastor, sometimes senior pastor, senior rabbi, etc. And you might have to bear with me as I go through some measurement issues, but to look at theology, I constructed a scale, and this is drawn from multiple questions asking the clergy about their theological orientation in terms of how exclusive they view the religion and how important it is for them to share the religion, as well as their positions on the gender politics, gender ideology, and LGBT people. So it involves questions that said all of the great religions of the world are equally good and true. People agreeing with that were coded as liberal, or my religion would be the best one for all people, no matter their background or current religion. People agreeing with that were coded as conservative. And then other questions such as belief in a literal hell, and would perform a same-sex wedding, even if their religious organization, if the religious organization allowed it. And so these were averaged together into a scale with a Cronbach's alpha of 0.87. This is well above the range that's typically acceptable for this sort of scale, indicating high levels of internal reliability. And as I mentioned earlier, I chose to look at direct action and cue giving separately. So to measure direct action, I created a scale, 4 items, which ask clergy if in the last year they had organized a group in their congregation to advance a political goal, urged people in their congregation to get involved in politics beyond just voting, lobbied a public official in their role as a clergy member, or participate in a protest or demonstration. And then to measure cue giving separately, clergy were asked if in the last year they had prayed out loud about a controversial political issue during a worship service, or took a stand on a controversial public issue while preaching, speaking, or communicating with their congregation. And both these scales also have internal reliability that's well within the traditional accepted range. So, and then finally, some important controls to mention. I included controls for clergy's age, the size of their congregation, rural, urban location, and region. A few important measures I want to mention here is that there are controls for political ideology, which is it's a question of how liberal or conservative do you think you are politically, and then vote preference in the 2016 election. So who the clergy voted for, whether they voted for Trump, Clinton, someone else, or they didn't vote at all. And these are controls that are included in the model. And then also I should mention that religious tradition is an important control. And as you'll see in the models, I look at the relationships between theology and political activism separately by religious tradition. Okay, so all that boring stuff out of the way, let's get to the results. So for direct action, this is, so technically this is a low S regression, but it's basically a line showing the relationship between a more liberal theology and direct action. And there's a very clear effect here. This is not accounting for any controls. This is just the bivariate relationship. But you can see the more liberal, theologically liberal clergy were substantially more likely to say they engaged in various direct political activist activities, protesting, lobbying, etc. There's not too much difference between the conservative and moderate clergy, but there is a massive effect at the liberal end of the scale. And this holds true even when controlling for politics and other demographic controls. The effect size of this is about an entire standard deviation on the dependent measure. In social science terms, that's about as big an effect as you get. And so for ease of interpretation, this is broken down by quartiles. So the 25% most conservative clergy here, the next 25% here, and so on. And as you can see, the most liberal 25% of clergy are just substantially more likely to engage in political activism. And there's not too much effect for the more conservative and moderate clergy. And this is certainly not reducible to political ideology at all. The political measures hardly mattered at all, and none of the demographic measures emerged as particularly significant. But one question is, does this relationship differ across traditions? Previously, most of this research has focused on predominantly white Protestants, but it's important to see if this kind of relationship holds true. And the answer is it does differ substantially across traditions. As we can see here, the green line and the blue line are the predominantly white Protestant traditions. So the green line is the conservatives, the conservative Protestant evangelical fundamentalist traditions. The blue line are the mainline Protestants. They seem largely similar. And the Black Protestant congregation clergy are also have a similar trajectory, where the more liberal clergy are much more engaged politically, but they have higher levels of activism overall. What's notable is the Catholics. The Catholic clergy do not share this relationship between liberal theology and high levels of direct action. If anything, the more conservative members might be more engaged, although it's not quite statistically significant. There's really not too strong of a relationship here. Now, Catholic clergy are highly active in political action across the board, but that activity is not strongly related to their theology, while it is in other traditions. And then also I should note the non-Christians here. This is a small sample size. It seems to be the non-Christians are largely following the trajectory of Protestant traditions, with more liberal religious leaders being more politically active. Although more research is needed here, there are a handful. This line is tracking a very small number of clergy at the more conservative end. There are a small number of non-Christian clergy who are espousing quite conservative theologies and are highly politically active, but more research needs to be done to really nail down that relationship. So that's the relationship for direct action. Let's turn to cue giving. And here there's a different picture. It's not just a uniform liberals are more active, but instead we see a curvilinear relationship where the liberals, theological liberals and conservatives are both engaged in Q giving, whereas the moderates are not as much. So there's higher rates of clergy talking about and discussing political issues at the ends of the spectrum. And once again, this generally holds true even when controlling for politics and other demographic features. It's not as strong a relationship as for direct action. This is an effect of about 0.4 standard deviations in this sort of research that's still moderately strong. And even when controlling for the political controls, demographic controls, we see this curvilinear relationship where the moderates are the least likely to talk about controversial political issues. And once again, does this relationship differ across traditions? And once again, the answer is yes, and it does so in a similar way. The Protestant traditions largely have this pattern of a curvilinear relationship where the moderates are the least likely to be discussing political issues. This is also holding true for the non-Christians of a similar pattern with the Protestants, but note the Catholics, as before, as with direct action, there is not this same relationship between a more liberal theology and political activism. Once again, if anything, it's the very conservative Catholic priests who are discussing politics more, although this is, again, not a very strong relationship, and it doesn't necessarily hold up to statistical test. And one more note is just to note, the Black Protestants are also following this general curvilinear trend. It might seem like it's bending downward at the end, but that's the line matching to a small number of cases. So in overall, there are a few conclusions. First is that the theological beliefs matter for political action in certain consistent ways among non-Catholic clergy. This sort of theological, this sort of relationship between theology measured this way and political activism does not hold true for Catholics. For Protestants and non-Christians, more liberal theology promotes more direct action. The liberals are highly politically active, highly engaged in protest and lobbying efforts and organizing efforts, whereas the moderates and conservatives are not. But when it comes to Q giving, theology has a curvilinear effect, where the moderates are the ones doing the least Q giving. And overall, going forward, these inform our understandings of how theology might inspire political activism among clergy. And it also forces us to rethink what is actually promoting political activism here, because these standard traditional measures of theology are not identifying a relationship between theology and political activism among Catholics. And so it may be that there are different theological themes that are motivating Catholic clergy to engage politically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will turn it over to Father Berrelleza for your responses.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Anna, Pamela, and Joseph for sharing your research with us today. I was happy to receive the invitation from the Boisi Center to respond to these papers, since my own work has also taken me to consider the political actions of religious congregations, both as corporate bodies, but also as individual religious actors in everyday life. First, my own study of the new sanctuary movement looked at the production of sanctuary, or the creation of safe spaces by the sanctuary residents themselves, those undocumented individuals under the threat of deportation who have to disrupt their lives and move into these unfamiliar spaces. In particular, I looked at the practices that were essential to survival as they were surrounded with these, religious strangers, especially as those sanctuary stays were prolonged with no clear end in sight, especially during the Trump presidency. But I've also studied the religious resources available to different denominations and the ways in which Latino immigrants leverage their stories and practices, and at times even borrow from the broader religious ecology of religion around them to negotiate the negative enforcement landscapes they find themselves in. So for the religious practitioners I've studied, these actions of resistance and accommodation to the reality of political regimes are a matter of survival. This is, they don't have a choice. They need to do this in order to actually live a life. So for political action, religious leaders can be essential, of course. So I appreciate the connections that I see between your two papers. And what I'd like to do today is first highlight what I see as contributions and then turn to some questions that might spur a broader conversation for us. So both of the papers highlight the role of religious leaders for political action, so I'd like to begin there. Congregations, as we know, are relational sites. They provide essential networks and resources for members as practitioners seek to make meaning of everyday life concerns and connect with the transcendent, this sort of twofold orientation of congregations. While a central purpose of these religious sites is oriented to accessing the otherworldly, it will be difficult to separate the religious congregation from its entanglements with the social world. Congregations are embedded in local places, and members bring their daily concerns with them when they gather. Scholars, of course, have detailed the blurring between the secular and the religious. And it's impossible, we know, to think of these worlds as separate and distinct. So it's also no wonder that politics are implicated in religious lives. This can prove a point of tension, of course, as some might prefer to maintain clear distinctions. And we've seen how congregations divide over whether to introduce politics or issues in their congregations. But recognizing the power of religious leaders to influence action in politics arose then the Johnson Amendment, which limits the direct endorsement of political candidates. The legislature says little, though, about political issues. And it's here that we've seen congregations activated around more particular causes: abortion concerns, immigrant accompaniment, and other issues. This often leads to the interpretation of support for a candidate or another, but it involves a dance of sorts, the cue giving, and the subtle messaging that's communicated to the congregation in preaching and in the offering of communal prayers. Other times we see direct action. So I appreciated, Joseph, your clear distinction between these. The decision to house a refugee, the participation in a protest, perhaps. What's clear is that religious leaders, because of their authority and being seen as legitimate authority, are able to organize members and are turned to for guidance about social and political activity. So what motivates them? What moves them to take a stand and bring their congregations along with them? So here I wondered about the ways in which the polity of the congregation might affect the decision of religious leaders to engage their congregants in political action. Both papers speak about theological foundations and orientations that might provoke action, but what about constraints of the religious leader due to the ways in which congregations are organized? Can some leaders be unwilling to speak out because of the tensions that might arise with their congregations? And in some cases where a congregational polity is present, I'm thinking here of Nancy Ammerman's distinctions of these congregations, of their polities, it is the members who will decide the term of the pastor. So for the sanctuary case, I thought about these constraints and the tension that such a decision can heighten. You mentioned the process by which congregations reflected on the decision to welcome a resident. And I wonder if you might say more here. who was involved in that decision? And did anyone leave over the decision to welcome an immigrant? So as we know, these can be pretty divisive topics. Both papers also raise some concerns or questions about Catholics and political action. There's a long tradition, of course, of Catholic social teaching and direct action. So I thought it was interesting that the theology of Catholics didn't really play a role in determining political involvement. I think this broader tradition might have something to do with it. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. And so what your paper, Joseph, helps us disentangle is that Protestants at the extremes are more engaged at cue giving, which might result, at least for the liberal Protestants, in more direct action. So I really appreciated your extending research here to account for the differences that occur between types of denominations. Could you perhaps say more then about why Catholic leaders might stand apart here? In my own research, I found that time of petitions during services, this key time of cue giving, was more prescribed for Catholics. And so because it was prescribed in that way, they were written out, they were also less spontaneous. Might that have an effect on how cues are given during services? And I think also the larger size of the congregation might have something to do with this. This can all influence the expression of political voice during worship. Now, I also found it interesting that preaching wasn't recalled as a key mechanism for promoting sanctuary by leaders. I think it'd be helpful to know a little more also about the size of those congregations. I imagine they're smaller. They were in the congregations I studied. And I imagine also that the process was quite extensive. But what your paper also highlights is that this action came about from a sense of identity. We're a congregation that welcomes a stranger, for example, right? So you talked about culture, but I think there's also this sense of this is just part and parcel of who they are. So I wonder about those questions of identity also, kind of as a broader way of framing this. There are other questions that come up for me, of course, like how did the recipients of sanctuary interact with the churches that you studied? And I have other questions. I think the use of third wave is very interesting. I think it's helpful to understand that this is a long tradition. So perhaps you can say a little bit more about that. And then, you know, I just think again, for Joseph, you know, this issue of to rethink of what promotes activism as you conclude here, right? I think that's a great way to think about this. And I wonder also if the length of time that a pastor is in a congregation will affect how politically active they are, and if you are able to control for that within your sample. That's what I got for now, and I have other questions written down here from your presentations, which I enjoyed. Thank you for your sharing with us.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know what the process is. Karina, is it okay with you if I just jump in? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll maybe start us off with some responses to that. Pamela, obviously you can jump in and contradict or correct or add on as you want to, and then we'll sort of go from there maybe. But yeah, thanks so much for your thoughtful response and for reading our papers and listening to the presentations. Yeah, you brought up a lot of things that we have been thinking about and sort of wrestling with in the presentation of our data and sort of getting it to something to sort of send out into the world. I think probably the most important thing we want to highlight is that while you obviously said that your work focuses on the experience of the sanctuary guests themselves, our research is sort of on the flip side. So obviously that in focusing on the experience of the congregations and the congregational leaders specifically, that misses a huge piece of the sort of sanctuary movement as a whole. And so we don't, I hope this didn't come across in our presentation. If it did, I apologize, but we don't want to privilege the experience of the congregations over the experience of the guests. For us, we were interested in the political mobilization of the organizations themselves. So that was our approach. But in terms of thinking about some of the specific questions you raised, so you asked specifically about the process of mobilization, the role of the pastor versus the role of the congregation, sort of the sacrifices inherent. Did anyone leave, sort of, etc. Yeah, so a few interesting things emerged. Well, a lot of interesting things emerged, but a few things I'll highlight is one, that almost no one left these congregations. I would say maybe, on average, maybe 1 to 2 people left each individual congregation. Most of them had a large sort of congregation-wide vote to decide to become a sanctuary congregation, and had, an incredibly high benchmark, like 90% had to say yes in order to go forward with it. So only a small minority was sort of able to say no if they were to go ahead with it. And obviously our sample was those who only went ahead with it. So I would say on the whole, there was little sacrifice in terms of sort of loss of parishioners or of membership. I will say in terms of the role of the pastor, I will say I think it was overall fairly downplayed. For example, we had multiple pastors who told us, when they were deciding to become a sanctuary congregation and deciding to bring someone in and sort of frame the legality of it, basically, they would say, okay, me, Pastor Anna, I'm gonna say that this was Pastor Anna's decision in some sort of legal document, so that if we basically get in trouble with ICE or the federal government or whoever, it will be my fault and not the congregation's fault. And multiple pastors tried to make this move, and they spoke about the ways the congregation said, absolutely not. This will be whatever Episcopal Church or whatever, United Methodist Church. We're not gonna, let you be the only person who takes the fall for this, because this is a congregational action. Which we found very interesting. And it seemed very important, again, going back to this idea of it's sort of a holistic culture of the congregation, willing to take on this form of activism. In terms of identity formation, another thing that sort of goes off what I just said, another thing we found that was interesting is we asked about the process of deciding to become a sanctuary congregation, obviously, and a lot of congregations, I would say, I don't have numbers in front of me, but I would say probably close to half, like a very large percentage, talked about their decision probably a decade, 5 to 10 years prior, their decision to welcome members of the LGBTQ community. And that decision to say, we're going to step out in this way of welcoming these, sort of the other in this other way, the stranger or neighbor or whatever that's sort of stigmatized in society, that had been a big turning point for their congregation 5 to 10 years prior. And so then they had already sort of laid this groundwork for this form of activism. And then when they decided to do sanctuary, though obviously undocumented individuals are a very different issue, has a lot of similar sort of political strains, I guess, or theological strains maybe. Joseph, I guess we learned about that. I should not falsely make an equivalence out of this. Based on Joseph's presentation, that had been sort of a big turning point for their congregation that then sanctuary was able to go off of. So again, sort of getting at the identity. And then finally, I do want to speak about the Catholic situation. I think Joseph has a lot more to speak on it than we do. But also Father Berrelleza, I apologize. Love to get your feedback on this. So our sample was 41 congregations, and it was 39 white mainline and 2 Jewish. We did interview 1 Black Protestant, historically Black Protestant, but we removed them from the sample because we were talking about race in this, for this presentation, we removed them because we were talking about race and it was obviously such an outlier. So we tried to identify basically every person in sort of public sanctuary that we could. During the Trump era, we identified about 60, tried to contact them all. 41 congregations responded. We were only able to identify about 2 Catholic congregations. Obviously, neither of them responded to us, but we did ask some of our respondents about that. And they gave us the impression that there's sort of a very important distinction between public sanctuary, which is sort of this public social movement, and then sort of private sanctuary. And so Catholics, our impression was that Catholic congregations mainly are doing this private sanctuary that was not trying to attract a lot of sort of public political attention, because Catholics obviously have a much larger percentage of Hispanic or documented individuals within their congregations. And so to say, hey, we're this, sanctuary congregation to the world would then bring sort of undue and unwanted attention on their congregations. And so that's why for us, we don't have any Catholic congregations in our sample. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that. If you think, what we're saying is correct, or the ways that might be a shortcoming, different ways to think about that. But yeah, just did want to touch on it since it was brought up. Pamela, sorry if I sort of covered all of the bases, but if you have anything to add, feel free.
No, I think you covered it all. The only thing that I wanted to add, or if I could pad with a little bit more detail, was the only instances where individuals did consider leaving their congregations or felt at conflict with the actions of their congregations was when they themselves held an occupation or worked in a job that they felt would be a conflict of interest. So they may have been a lawyer, a judge, or they felt that their position kind of socially or how they were employed would conflict with the overall actions of the church and would maybe bring undue consequences. So those were the only instances, and I talked about it in the paper, but not ultimately the presentation. Those were the instances where we really saw parishioners kind of questioning whether they were of the congregation if they move forward with the sanctuary initiative.
Great. And do you want me to respond now, or
Yeah.
should we let Joseph?
That's probably easiest. It's kind of up to you. We're such a small group.
Okay. So I think you're right about it's the same answer I got with the Catholic churches, that they have large Latino populations, especially, and presumably a larger number of undocumented members than other congregations, and they didn't want to bring attention to themselves. Now, I do think that one of the protections, though, that helps to distinguish this time of sanctuary from the last iterations is that this public stance allows them to negotiate this question of harboring criminals, right? And so I'm suspicious of whether private sanctuary actually exists to the extent that the Catholics are claiming that they're participating in this private. Because I think the public, the lawyers I spoke to about this were saying that the public stance allowed them to sort of indicate to ICE, the person's here, and we're not hiding from you. And the other thing, I think what they're playing on there also is this MOU, right? That churches are sensitive locations and that ICE will not enter a sensitive location. So I think that, those kinds of aspects need to be brought into this question of like, these public cases matter, right? And it provided a protection because it kept ICE sort of aware and sort of at arm's length as well.
Okay. I guess I'll go ahead and respond. Trying to think of a way to make this flow nicely, but sometimes, but yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate the feedback and the comments, and this is very helpful. And so a couple of things. So some small notes. You mentioned the length of the time that the pastor had served in the congregation. I have not looked at that, but I have the capability to do so. And so I made a note and put a little star next to it, and I'll look into it. As for size of the congregation, and also a bigger picture of polity and restraint that these pastors might have, I was kind of surprised that I didn't find a lot of evidence. And now certainly the polity matters, certainly the restraint matters. There was basically no relationship of size. It just didn't seem like it had an effect that large at all. And I was kind of surprised. I didn't find a lot of evidence that these sort of restraining features were showing up as being particularly predictive of activism. What really shined through was these theological variables as being very strongly connected to activism. And so it's kind of surprising. I need to do some more work into that, but it seemed like, these leaders are in privileged positions, and there are barriers, but they are also privileged and can mobilize and speak to their congregates and engage in activism to some degree. They have enough latitude to do that. And it may be that where the constraints come in is more, so even with my measure, it's scoring a pastor who scores fairly high on the measure could simply be doing just some moderate amount of activism. It could be that the restraints come in at the high end, where maybe there's a pastor who would really love to take it up to the next level, but in my measure, they're just at the top. They're just toward the top, and that next level of activism is just not being captured. So that could be happening. But at least in some initial going from nothing to something, it doesn't seem like those restraints are playing that much of a role. And so just a couple of small things. I am very grateful for the feedback about the Catholics. I recognize I'm not as knowledgeable about Catholicism and Catholic theology as I think I need to be for this paper. And I realized one thing. So I realized that I think I may have misspoke a little when I said that it doesn't seem like theology matters for Catholic. Obviously, theology matters a great deal in motivating Catholic activism. But what is the case is how it's being measured here. It's either it's not capturing the variation and the way that variation is promoting activism. And so a couple of things might be going on. One is that too much of the literature, the bulk of the literature, has been overly focused on Protestants and looking at the salient differences between conservative and liberal Protestants. And so I think it may be the case that even some of the questions on the survey, the questions that are getting at trying to get at theological beliefs, have a Protestant bias in that they're targeting areas that are salient differences for Protestants, and there aren't questions that are identifying those salient areas for Catholics. So I think that might be the case. But it's also true that Catholics, they do across the board have high levels of activism. They stand out from other clergy in the breadth of their activism. So it's something I didn't have enough time to go into, but we also looked into the kinds of issues that clergy say they're active on. And Catholics really stand out for being active on just a huge number of issues. There are certain issues that they're the only ones who are really active on, such as the death penalty. And so I think there is something to the fact that there is a stream that's institutionalized to various degrees, where it's expected that Catholic priests, that pastors are engaged socially, are engaged in politics in this way. And that's cross-cutting theological beliefs. Whereas for the Protestants, the theological beliefs, your perspective on how important it is to convert people versus how important it is to make the world a better place, that really matters a lot. And so the clergy who are, they believe that hell is real and that it's like really important to keep people from going there and that sort of thing, they're changing the world to make it better is just not as important as saving people and like convincing them to not sin. Whereas for more liberal Protestants who maybe don't think of hell literally or don't have as strong, have a more inclusivist idea of who might get saved, whatever saved means, do have this focus on making the world a better place. And that's a key dividing line. And for Catholics, the questions which may be interpreted in different ways and tap into different sort of theologies, it's not identifying those places. So I think that those two things are probably going on.
I wonder also, as you were speaking, I was thinking about Catholic Charities, and they do a lot of these. They do a lot of the outreach, right? So I wonder if it's just like the way that the denomination is organized, right? It's sort of Catholic Charities' bigger job to do that. St. Vincent de Paul, whoever's doing sort of the direct work for them, and their job is really to partner, and so something else to consider, right, as another possibly confounding issue there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is just like the first step for a lot more, but yeah, your feedback it's very helpful.
Can I possibly hop in and ask a couple of questions? Is that cool?
Please do.
Great, thanks. I really, really enjoyed both of these presentations. Yeah, so I mean, building on this last set of questions, something that I was thinking about also in terms of like what might be explaining some of this variance in political engagement. I guess two things strike me. So one is based on, I used to work for the National Policy Office for the Reformed Jewish Movement, and something that strikes me is like, does it matter which denominations have sort of centrally coordinated political work, right? We would like provide congregations with like legislative updates and materials and teach people how to lobby and teach people how to organize, right? Like, does having that matter? And particularly, does that matter when the politics of the national denomination and the national denomination's policy office align with the personal politics or the theology of the particular clergy member? So I guess that was one thing that I was thinking about. And I guess the other thing too was like thinking about maybe this is like too sort of esoteric, but thinking about like how different clergy might define what constitutes politics as such, right? So if someone's asked like, do you engage in politics, right? Does someone think about preaching about family values from the pulpit as being political work? And would they answer, yes, I do political work if they do that? So yeah, also just curious about how you're thinking about that. And then for Anna and Pamela, I guess like listening to your presentation about the sanctuary movement, the new sanctuary movement. So I've done a lot of work on the 1980 sanctuary movement, and what strikes me is that like most of the sort of rhetoric that you're pulling out is very similar, right? Like, so my work is about in part about the role of liberation theology in the 1980 sanctuary movement. And so I guess I'm just curious if you have given some thought to like that connective tissue and where that might come from. And I guess particularly like how to what extent are new sanctuary activists sort of consciously engaged in like kind of recovering and building on this sort of like what they see as the legacy of the 1980 sanctuary movement. My sense is that it's actually a lot of the same people. That it's a lot, or that at least the kind of more seasoned folks in the new sanctuary movement are veterans of the 1980 sanctuary movement, and so there might be some sort of knowledge that's being passed down or some ways of talking about sanctuary that are being passed down. But I'm curious if that's been your experience too. And then just was also going to reflect on thinking about private sanctuary. This is also a kind of debate in the 1980s about public sanctuary versus private sanctuary. And in that time, what constituted private sanctuary was basically like helping undocumented, or in that case, undocumented Central American refugees, right? Basically just like sort of disappear into communities, right? So it wasn't like keeping someone in a church or synagogue, but not announcing it publicly. It was more like people affiliated with the religious community, basically helping that person like find a family member who could kind of take that person into their apartment, or like it was basically like transporting people to places where there were large Central American communities that the person could sort of disappear into the community. So I guess I'm also just wondering about like, is that when people talk about private sanctuary today, like what exactly are they talking about? Is it mainly about sort of just providing services to people who are outside of the kind of congregational space as such, and trying to kind of help them avoid being arrested and deported? Or is it actually the case that people are providing like church sanctuary, traditionally defined today, but not publicly announcing it? Because I think that was not what was happening in the 1980s. But anyway, thank you so much. I really enjoyed both of these and the discussion.
All right, we have some more time, but if we want to wrap up, that's cool too, unless anyone has any final thoughts or questions.
I have just a couple quick thoughts to Adam's points, which I appreciate. As for whether a denomination having central resources matters, I don't know. And my gut is it might not actually matter that much, but it's definitely worth looking into. Just because some of the other institutional type measures I tried didn't seem to matter all that much. Maybe just because it's sort of all tied together, and the denominations that have decentralized type offices are also the ones who have clergy that are more liberal, and also the ones that have clergy that are more active. But it's definitely worth, it's something that I haven't super looked into, so it's definitely worth looking into. And then your other question about like conservative clergy, whether or not when they're talking about things like family values or abortion, whether they're thinking about this politically, I think that's an excellent question. And I had this exact conversation with someone kind of recently where I was talking about my work with a friend who is a conservative Lutheran, so Lutheran Missouri Synod. And she said, one thing, I started talking about my work about, looking into religious leaders and whether they're talking about politics. And she said, yeah, one thing I really appreciate about our pastor is he doesn't really talk about politics that much. Well, I guess he talks about abortion, but and she's kind of like, I don't really think of that as politics. It's more of a moral issue. So I think that there is potentially some of this. And at the end of the day, we are kind of letting them make their judgment of, they're saying, I am talking on a political issue, or although I think the phrasing of the question is like a controversial issue, like public issue. So, we're hoping that they're interpreting that to include things like abortion, and it seems like most of them are, but it wouldn't surprise me if there is some amount of undercounting, maybe on both sides, even of people who are in not thinking about preaching on things like poverty or racial justice or abortion or same-sex marriage as political, but are thinking of it as religious. So I just find it's a great point, and one that I'm trying to keep in mind.
Yeah, and we'd also, love to respond real quick to Adam as well. Yeah, thanks for your thoughts. Yeah, sanctuary it's so it's such a complex topic, and so with a long history and complex things happening even today, and so it's great to sort of get other people's thoughts. So really interesting. A few things you brought up made me think. So one was that you said that your assumption was most of the people who offered sanctuary during the Trump administration was, that they were sort of the seasoned veterans. I think you said something like that.
Yeah, not most, but just I have a sense that there's like a lot of people who were involved in the 80s are involved in the new sanctuary movement. They're like sprinkled throughout the new sanctuary movement. Yeah.
Yeah. So our impression was that, and again, we didn't talk to everyone, but we did talk to, the majority of the people that we were able to find. And so our impression was that those sort of, seasoned professionals or whatever were sort of holding things like workshops or talks or, spreading information about sanctuary, where I think a lot of these people got the idea of loving your neighbor or welcoming the stranger, or thinking about liberation theology in a more sort of robust way. But the people actually, and by people I mean congregations and congregational leaders actually doing sanctuary, I think only 2 of the 41 congregations we interviewed did any sort of sanctuary prior to 2016. So they were all very new to it. And I'll say that a lot of them were basically said like, sanctuary is not a good idea. Like no one should do this again, basically. That, a lot of them used words like voluntary incarceration, things like that, that this was just really not a good idea for the person in sanctuary. That, there wasn't this sort of process of sort of getting them into the congregation to prevent deportation and then transporting them to this other area and sort of easing that process. It was come into our congregation and then just stay here until Donald Trump lets you leave, basically. And obviously the Trump administration never let that happen. The Biden administration seems to be like working with some of them, but I think there's some variability there. So I think that was one of the more interesting things, was that there seemed to be a lot of sort of youthful exuberance among the sanctuary folks, and that a lot of them, when they talked about their sort of the legacies they were following in their mobilization, some of them didn't mention any former sanctuary, instances of the sanctuary movement. Maybe they talked about the Underground Railroad, or they talked about, examples in the Old Testament maybe, but some of them, didn't say like, obviously in the 1980s this happened, and that was just not a sort of part of their consciousness, in the same way that we frankly really expected it to be. So interesting things to think about. The public-private thing is, I think, sort of like something that I'm hesitant to even talk about, because it's all sort of like assumptions that our respondents made about congregations they weren't actually working with. You know what I mean? And so I can't even really speak to without being sure that I'm wrong, basically. What's happening there, but definitely something that needs more attention, especially maybe by somebody who has direct access to those sort of communities. Pamela, again, feel free to jump in. Sorry that I keep just going for it.
Very good. I don't have anything to add. Thanks.
So Adam's point makes me think about, it's important to, I think, one term I think would be important to help further refine your paper is this question about physical sanctuary, right? Because I think that's what's new about this form of sanctuary that's occurring now. That's what's different from the 1980s, where it was a broader accompaniment of the immigrant, and that's still going on, right? That kind of sanctuary is still occurring. Well, what's new about, you spoke about the third wave, is that now people need physical sanctuary and public stances of sanctuary. So that's the political action, right? Because that's defying the enforcement apparatus. And so I think I think that part needs to sort of be pulled into your paper somehow, so that it's clear that this is a political act. The other thing I was thinking about is this question about that came up in your paper, support from local and state politicians. That's not the case throughout, right? I mean, there are states where there are negative voices at play, and I think that should sort of be accounted for somehow as well. I also appreciated your, the kind of bigger question for Joseph on the lobbying arms. USCCB, right, comes to mind for the Catholics also. They seem to be much more intent on figuring out who takes communion and not. But but I think in other times they should be accounted for as well as part of the puzzle for what's possible. Bishops also what's possible for the Catholic pastors of their congregations. I have one other point on the racial awareness. Sorry, I'm just looking through my jotted down notes here. The racial awareness piece. It's also this moment in time, right? This police brutality, Black Lives Matter movement, Trump. I mean, it's very interesting to me that they raise this as a racial question when it's dealing with immigrants who are not racially different. So it's a racialization of the immigrant, which I think is a very interesting sort of move, and that comes up in the interviews as primary is really interesting. So there's that. Interfaith coalitions didn't come up in your paper. I wonder about that also, if you have anything. But all in all, both, I mean, impressive samples, the sort of a tough thing to achieve, as you know, but great samples on both as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, maybe I'll respond quickly and then maybe we'll wrap up. Sorry, I feel like we keep saying this will be the last thing and then another question, another response. So, which is totally fine. So thinking about, so something both your question and Adam's question made me think about was really, I think something that the third wave of sanctuary is marked by is sort of the routinization of sanctuary. So for example, from my understanding of earlier waves of sanctuary was that it basically was like, people sort of showed up at congregations close to the border and they were sort of welcomed in and then sort of resourced away and then, et cetera. In this, these congregations had vetting committees and they had requirements for the individuals they would and would not let into their congregational spaces. And, they had people that, one congregation had this vetting committee and they vetted this person and let them in and then found out later that the person had basically not been wholly truthful about their situation. And they talked about, what a terrible situation that had been for their congregation, and so it was much more sort of routinized than sort of earlier instances of the sanctuary movement, which I think is something we, didn't draw on in this paper. I think that, something we tried to do with this paper was just sort of zero in on this one certain aspect of sanctuary that we found in our interviews. But I think likely what we need to do next is just sort of like take 10 steps back and maybe just produce sort of like an overview paper or something about the third sanctuary movement or third wave of the sanctuary movement and sort of the differences and similarities that we see. But also, again, sorry, I keep saying this. The very last thing I'll say about your comment about race was that, obviously, like, we agree. We didn't expect, these white congregational leaders to say, to sort of racialize these undocumented individuals in the same way that they would sort of racialize maybe a, African-American person. But, they talked about their advocacy for Black Lives Matter directly, in the same breath as they talked about sanctuary. And so for them, it was just totally one cohesive thing in their sort of mindset. We did start the interviews right before the summer of 2020. And so obviously this is sort of in the public consciousness. But yeah, we were surprised by that. and that would have been, you know, in a longer than an 8-page paper, we probably would have explored that more, but definitely a good point. So
there was some vetting in the 1980 sanctuary movement too. There were people in Mexico who were meeting with refugees in Mexico City and determining whether they were appropriate for sanctuary. And part of the controversy in the movement is that part of what they were determining was whether they were revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries, and people who were counter-revolutionaries were deemed not fit for sanctuary. And so some people in the movement thought that was good because it was like advancing the political agenda of the sanctuary movement. And some people thought that was bad because it was not just responding to the full breadth of the humanitarian need of the refugee crisis. But yeah.
Yeah, cool. Maybe a conversation we can continue offline.
Thanks, everybody. I think one of the nicest things about these small groups is that conversations can kind of spring up like that. We have lots of time to get into things and go on tangents and things like that. But I'm really grateful to our presenters today, and also Father Berrelleza, and it's been great to listen to everybody. And we'll end here and take a few moments before our sort of closing meeting with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.
Bye.
Good afternoon.